Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuary series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Today's webinar features a Catalyst project whose goal is to build capacity to analyze swamp data by engaging NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, Centralized Data Management Office, UW-Madison graduate students, and some staff from reserves. And a major focus of this project was developing a graduate level class at University of Wisconsin-Madison in which students worked with reserves to address swamp synthesis needs. And you'll hear more detail from members of the project team who are with us today in a moment. But before we get started, I'll just give a quick introduction to the reserve system for folks who are not as familiar, the Science Collaborative, and this series. So, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves as shown on this map, with more on the way. NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or a nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide here, so land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The NERRS Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. And the Collaborative Science for Estuaries series features project teams supported by the NERRS Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. If that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to join us for future webinars to learn about new methods to integrate experts and users into the research process and how the research results and products might inform your work. A quick note here on informed consent. So webinars are really valuable learning opportunities for our program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing collaborative science. For example, in the development of future workshops, webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies to add to our guide to collaborative science, which is open access, so it's free to the public. Anybody can look at it. With that in mind, we want to inform attendees that insights or feedback you share, for example, in chat or via a webinar survey, may be used to help us with program learning and development. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we'd like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you to seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. All quotes would be used anonymously. So we're grateful for the opportunity to learn alongside you. And last thing about housekeeping, all attendees are muted upon entry, and we'll be handling presentation questions via the Q&A feature, and you can see in your little console there. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and we'll try to discuss as many as we can during the final part of today's webinar as well. Chat is visible to everyone, so please do use it to talk amongst yourselves, and feel free to use it as well to alert us if you have any technical questions or issues throughout the webinar. So on that note, I will introduce our speakers for today. So joining us today are Kate Reinl, Research Coordinator at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve, Paul Hansen, a Research Professor and Scientist at University of Wisconsin-Madison's Center for Limnology, and Sylvia Yang, who's the Research Coordinator for the Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks for the intro, Nick. I'm Kate Reinl. I'm the Research Coordinator at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve. I'm going to be giving this presentation with some input, but mostly speaking on behalf of our project team, Sylvia and Paul, who you can see if you want to give a wave there on their videos. Thanks everybody so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully this will be a nice way to either coast through the middle of your day, depending on which time zone you're in, or maybe kind of get into the end of your day before the weekend. We're really excited to tell you about this Catalyst project that we had that we're just wrapping up through the NERRS Science Collaborative Catalyst project. So we'll go ahead and jump in. So Nick covered this a little bit, but I'll just reiterate. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a network of 30 reserves around the country that were designated through the Coastal Zone Management Act in 1972 that represent a partnership between states and NOAA, where NOAA gives us our marching orders and the state partner carries out the day-to-day operations. So I'm at the Lake Superior Reserve, so that's located here in Superior, Wisconsin. And our state partner is University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. So I'm at the same university as Paul, our technical lead on this project. So the different programs or sectors, as we call them in the reserve: research, education, outreach, and stewardship, have a lot of really amazing core programs in what they do. But we're going to focus on one program in particular, and that's the system-wide monitoring program, or what we call SWMP. So the system-wide monitoring program began in 1995, with the goal of understanding short-term variability and long-term change in coastal ecosystems. Data collection is standard across the reserves, but looks different beyond what's required. So sometimes there's additional things that are collected in addition to the core pieces of the system-wide monitoring program. So the main components of the system-wide monitoring program are water quality data that's collected every 15 minutes year-round, except for at locations where there's ice cover, such as here in Superior, Wisconsin. This data is being collected using a sonde equipped with sensors, and each reserve has a minimum of 4 stations where they're doing this kind of data collection. Meteorological data is also collected every 15 minutes year-round, and there's at least 1 meteorological station at each reserve. And then each reserve also collects monthly nutrient grabs and conducts wetland vegetation surveys on a regular basis. And so I wanted to show a little bit of the specifics of what's being collected here. So you have a really kind of an idea of the full scope of data collection that's a part of SWMP. So for meteorological data, we have air temperature, relative humidity, pressure, precipitation, wind speed and direction, and PAR, or photosynthetically active radiation. I'm really getting at the light available for photosynthesis, essentially. For water quality, we have water temperature, dissolved oxygen, salinity, specific conductivity, turbidity, pH, and depth. And at some reserve, there's also a total algae sensor to get an idea of chlorophyll concentrations in the water. And then those monthly nutrient grabs include ammonium, nitrite, nitrate, nitrite, nitrate, orthophosphate, and chlorophyll. And those are the core pieces. And as I said before, some reserves go above and beyond and collect parameters outside of these that might be of specific interest to what's going on in their system in particular. Okay, so how much data are we actually talking about here? So I wanted to really break this down so that people have an idea of like really the full scope of what's being collected. So we're collecting one data point every 15 minutes. There's 60 minutes in an hour. There's 24 hours in a day. There's 365 days in a year. So we'll just go with that and pretend that ice is not a thing for the purposes of this. That's about 35,000 data points per year. So there are 7 water quality parameters on a sonde, as I shown before: temperature, specific conductivity, pH, salinity, turbidity, DO, and depth. So multiplying that 35,040 times 7 parameters is 245,280 data points per year for one sonde. You take that and multiply it times 4 stations, which is the minimum required for a reserve. And that gives you almost 1 million data points at a single reserve with only 4 stations for only 1 year and only for water quality alone. So you have to keep in mind that there are 30 reserves around the country. Some of them have been collecting this data for over a decade. Some of them have more than 4 stations, and some of them are collecting data even beyond the parameters that I outlined before. So this is a huge amount of data that's being collected. This is a really rich and valuable data set that we have to understand and protect these really valuable coastal ecosystems. And so it goes. This is a really challenging thing to analyze. So the regular synthesis of SWMP data is a part of the original plan when designing SWMP, but collecting, processing, vetting, and publishing all of this data is a huge undertaking. And often leaves reserves with limited capacity to actually analyze the data to understand these systems and inform coastal management. And this is not an issue that's unique to the NERRS. It's really an issue in data collection all around. There's a lot of time spent collecting the data, but it's really difficult sometimes to find the time to to analyze these data sets. And so this is really kind of one of the biggest pieces of motivation for the proposal that we put together. So this led to the development of this Catalyst proposal that took place over 1 year and was funded through the NERRS Science Collaborative. The name of our proposal, or title of our proposal, was Synthesizing Long-Term SWMP Data Sets to Quantify Estuarine Ecosystem Dynamics and Identify Trends Along an Ecological Gradient. So these little bubbles that are shown here, are you guys able to see my mouse as I move it around? Can somebody nod that I can see? Yeah, okay, great. So the ones that are shown in yellow were the 7 reserves that were directly engaged in this class. And then there were an additional 5 reserves that were engaged with the project development and the outputs. And so we had a really nice geographic spread of partners that were engaged through this project, both directly and indirectly. So we had several goals for this overall project. The first was just pretty basic. Just use SWMP to address science and management needs using a data-driven approach. Essentially, just use SWMP for what it's for. Get that data analyzed. Another piece that we wanted to address in this project was creating a sustained mechanism for future SWMP synthesis. So this capacity issue, seeing if we can devise some way to alleviate these capacity issues over the long term, not just kind of a one and done effort. We also wanted to try out some new analyses to quantify system dynamics and evaluate trends and identify state shifts. We also wanted to promote an increased understanding of change in coastal ecosystems, so using the swamp data to understand that short-term variability and long-term change as was intended when it was the program was developed. We also wanted to increase NERRS visibility and especially visibility of the really valuable swamp datasets to the wider community. And then we also wanted to position the NERRS swamp synthesis work group to pursue future funding, to continue to do these analyses. And what was really cool, and we've kind of alluded to at the beginning of this talk, was at the center of all this was this graduate course. So we wanted to basically achieve all of these goals with a graduate student course that was taught at UW-Madison at the center of this. So this course was developed with all of the 12 participating reserves. And it was co-taught by our technical lead, Paul Hansen. So the class was actually housed down at UW-Madison at the Center for Limnology. And then I co-taught zooming in from afar up in Superior, Wisconsin. And so we wanted to provide students with this really great opportunity to work with big ecological data sets because that's a really valuable skill and very marketable now. But it also kind of achieves all these other goals surrounding this kind of central piece of this graduate course. So students had the opportunity to work with these really rich long-term data sets and address real science or management needs that were put forward by the 7 reserves that were directly involved in the project. And we wanted to pilot this as a possible model to continue into the future, where students would analyze swamp data during a semester-long graduate student course to address these capacity issues around analyzing swamp data, while also providing a high-quality opportunity for graduate students. So this class was offered in spring 2024 and lasted from January until May. So within that larger project, we had this class, and the specific goals of the class were twofold. So the first one was just kind of that piece of using swamp data to identify and address science and management needs using a data-driven approach. And the second was to provide this high quality training opportunity that also creates a sustained mechanism for swamp analysis. But we also took this second piece and we broke it out into kind of 2 portions. The training portion was broken out into 2 pieces. The first one was the big ecological data skills. So we wanted to provide them with tools in their tool belt to be able to go forth and analyze long-term data sets because, as I said before, this is a really valuable skill and something that more and more employers are looking for, and it's things that they could actually use in their own research. But the second thing that came out in the development of this course was a collaborative objective and working with students to teach them how to do kind of like what we've been referring to as the NERRS brand of collaborative science and doing using integrated science. So instead of just taking these questions that the reserves had and giving them to the students and saying, hey, can you answer these? We wanted to make this collaborative and really make it a 2-way process. So the students work with the reserves throughout the entire semester, as opposed to just having the question handoff and not really having any kind of like interaction. So we had the technical objective where we wanted to work on big ecological data skills. And then we also had this collaborative objective where we wanted to work with the students to develop their skills in doing user integrated science. So as we were developing this proposal, we very quickly realized it was not going to be ideal to just have everybody having the same thing analyzed for all the reserves for a couple of reasons. First, we had to constrain the total number of parameters being analyzed just because of the scope of the class. So even though there might be things that if we analyzed all of the parameters, there might be something for everyone. That wasn't really something that was possible for the students to do. We couldn't have them analyze all of the nutrient data and all of the water quality data and all the meteorological data. So as we tried to refine these, it became pretty clear that just choosing the same for all 7 of the reserves was not going to be ideal because there's a wide range of systems, and that leads to a wide range of importance for the parameters. So for example, here in the Great Lakes, we tend to be less interested in salinity. And at various reserves, the focus might differ between dissolved phosphorus or nitrogen inputs. During the proposal development, we also decided that we would only use primary swamp parameters that could be downloaded from the CDMO data repository. So taking all this into account, we settled on the decision that reserves could select a combination of sites and parameters with at least 10 years of data for up to a total of 5 analyses. So all of the students were using the same analyses. We knew what those analyses were ahead of time. But we had some flexibility built into this process, so reserves could really kind of hone in on something that they specifically wanted answered. And you'll see later in the webinar kind of how that played out. Something else to keep in mind is that when we were designing this kind of portion of the proposal and of the class, we didn't know how many students were going to be enrolled in this class. So that was a little bit of rolling the dice and seeing how things fell out, but you'll see that it ended up working out pretty well. Okay, so what do we mean when we're talking about big ecological data skills? Because that can actually mean a lot of things in and of itself. And so for this, we really just focused on like long-term time series analyses. So students were working with data sets that were at least 10 years long, and they applied 4 widely applicable time series analyses. So they could be appropriate for many different questions that were being answered. So these analyses were chosen in part because they could be used to address a wide range of questions. But they also were chosen because they're a mix of kind of bread and butter analyses, if you will, or things that all data analysts should have in their toolkit. And some of them were kind of novel things that hadn't been applied and that we wanted to try out because we thought they would be cool and interesting. So they first performed a decomposition of the time series to break it down into its various components. They took a quantitative approach to determining whether the underlying series or the processes underlying the series were nonlinear or linear, and that was the system dynamics piece. They also did a Mann-Kendall trend test to determine whether there were monotonic trends in the data upward or downward, and then use SendSlope to calculate the actual slope of those trends. And then they also did breakpoint analysis to identify structural changes in the data, so statistically significant changes in the data. So those were the 4 analyses that we worked with the students to develop and apply to their data sets. That said, you'll see later in the presentation that some students brought some other analyses, and we learned a little bit in that regard too. On the collaborative objective side, we pulled from the guide to collaborative science. So this was one of the novel parts of this class that you often don't see in these types of capstone projects where students are working with industry partners or other partners. So what this really meant for us was conducting user integrated research where the interested parties or stakeholders or users are a part of the process from the beginning of the end. And so we took this guide to collaborative science and we kind of evaluated the different pieces that were applicable and used the toolkit and integrated them into the class to teach students how to conduct this type of research and also to have improved outputs for the reserves that were involved in the class to better suit their needs, because that was an important part of this process as well. Okay, so what did this look like exactly to incorporate these various tools into the class? So first, students were really given total ownership over their relationship with a reserve partner. We really just kind of like set up the scaffolding for this relationship. We had on the schedule various checkpoints, but we really just left it to the students to be in the driver's seat on that and really had a pretty hands-off approach. And we feel like that was a really important experience for students, both for having a really authentic relationship with the reserves and also just like practical professional development skills. Students were also matched with reserve partners based on students' interests in questions being asked by the reserve. So at the beginning of the semester, we had reserves, the 7 reserves that were involved in the class, submit kind of like a teaser video for why is your reserve really cool and what are the questions you're trying to ask. So students got to watch all these videos and then they ranked their preference for which reserve they wanted to be matched with. And actually almost all of the students were able to be matched with their top choice for reserve. I think there were only 1 or 2 students who had the second choice. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because when you're excited about something and interested in something, you tend to work really hard on it. It tends to be a better output. So that was kind of a cool piece of this class. Students also worked with reserves to develop a project charter, which is something that we, the project team, Sylvia, Paul, and I did with all of the reserves at the beginning of this project. And we used that as a template and as a guide for the students to develop one with their reserve partners so that they had a good understanding of what their reserves wanted. The reserves had a good understanding of what the students would be doing. And also just it's another kind of like tool development, professional development opportunity for the students. To just make sure that there's a clear understanding between both parties and just also an anchor point, I think, to like what is the scope of what we're working on. And we did revisit that throughout the semester. And then lastly, students engaged with the reserves regularly throughout the process to collaboratively interpret their data and tailor their products. So we had checkpoints throughout the semester where students were meeting with their reserve partners. We were not involved in those meetings. Those, as I said, the students were in the driver's seat for those. But students would, kind of give project updates and this is what we're working on, or hey, we've done breakpoint analyses. We don't know why there are breakpoints here. Can you use your local knowledge to help me understand what is going on here? And so there was that back and forth that led to a lot of great collaboration for better understanding of what the analyses were, and a better relationship and better products. So another really cool component of this was a field trip. So the students took a 3-day field trip up to the Lake Superior NERR. So that was about 5 hours north, up in Superior, Wisconsin, to spend some time doing experiential learning in an estuarine system. And so the goal of this field trip was to just step away from the analysis for a little bit and get a better understanding of what a reserve is, all the different programs that operate under one roof and how they complement one another. And then we also wanted to have them spend some time on an estuary to see what the data collection looks like and just have that kind of like concrete understanding of like, what is an estuary? What kind of place am I working on? And of course, this gave students the opportunity to build relationships with each other and just have a little fun, which is always a great part of any field trip. So a little bit of what they did was understanding where swamp data comes from. So we spent some time outside hiking from the upper estuary to the lower estuary throughout their visit here and collecting data to understand how water quality changes along that gradient from upper to lower estuary out into Lake Superior. We did a data mystery on monomen or wild rice with the education team to see how these types of data sets can be translated into an educational purpose and looking at one of the kind of core things that the education sector does in the reserve system. We practiced science communication with our CTP coordinator, Karina Heim. We did this message box exercise about how to take your research and translate it to many different types of audiences, and that was a really fun exercise. We also met with reserve collaborators and the students got a better understanding of how we do place-based work. So we had folks like Matt Steiger from Wisconsin DNR come in and talk about the area of concern and how we've worked and interacted with the area of concern to help understand and protect the St. Louis River. And then we also learned about restoration efforts and research by going out with our stewardship coordinator out into the estuary and on the landscape and learning about replacement of trees in black ash forests and some of the threats that are happening there. And then finally, something that was kind of unique to this trip is that the Lake Superior Reserve is completely on ceded territory of Ojibwe people. And so we spent a lot of time with the Lake Superior the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, learning about their sovereignty and the work that they do and how to work with tribes in a good way, because that's a big component of what we do here at the Lake Superior Reserve. So this was another really cool component to this data analysis class where they actually got to like go on a field trip and spend time with people and learn a lot more about what it's like to do place-based work and work with different people. So before we go into a little bit more about what the students did in their various projects, I wanted to share a couple of really nice representative quotes of students' experiences during these field trips. So this one's from Ian Hart. He said, the course was a real eye-opener to the possibilities of a targeted use to large environmental data sets. As someone who was in their last semester and looking for career options outside of academia, getting experience with user-driven data science was essential. Beyond the analytical techniques, I learned how to conduct research with user needs as the keystone. And I think that's something that's really core to the reserve system and how we look at our data. And then I just want to share one more, and this is from Danny Sadlowski. My biggest takeaway was a deeper understanding of the concept of place-based science. A lot of my own science is place-based, but occurs on lakes I've known since I was a kid. Because of that familiarity, I don't often think enough about what makes my study area unique. This trip gave me the mental space and tools to think more deeply about place-based science through our comparison of different sites, learning about the disturbance history of the area, and hearing from the people of the Fond du Lac. It re-inspired my eye for place in a way that could not have happened in a classroom and helped me to reconnect to the waters we spend so much of our time thinking about. So this was like a really important experience in a lot of ways. I just wanted to kind of highlight the things that the students took away from this, which was above and beyond kind of what we expected going into this field trip. So I'm going to hand it over to Paul for just a moment because he spent a lot of time with the students and has done a lot of this kind of flavor of teaching, and to talk a little bit about his perspective on the class, and then we'll give you some student project highlights.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I'll just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking around this slide in the background. And the first thing that I want to say is what a privilege it was to work with Kate and Sylvia and the entire NERRS community. Gosh, what a great opportunity and fun experience. And so on behalf of myself and the students and our graduate program too, a big thank you to all those who were involved and helped supported this activity. I just want to make a couple of comments around kind of the two main points that Kate has made already, which is a technical aspect, what the students are working on, and a collaborative aspect. And I'm going to add one more, which is a secret sauce part of something that happened. So, you know, we all know that the world is sort of a time-driven system, and there are a lot of programs like yours that are collecting big repositories of time-based data. And yet in our graduate programs, we have remarkably few opportunities to dig in to time series data and understand the issues in time series data and confront them. And there are a lot of issues that are common to different time series, whether they're kind of the statistical issues of stationarity or non-stationarity and autocorrelation. There are lots of different scales of variability through time, from days and seasons and years to decades, and also just trying to capture and understand the nature of change in systems, whether it's trends or step changes or changes in the statistical properties of the system. And it's one thing to get the data and analyze the data, which is a little bit dry, but a useful thing for students to do. But I think what we all recognize is to be able to interpret and understand and really make good use of those data requires that local expert knowledge. And being able to collaborate with people from the sites, both in understanding what the issues and motivations for the analyses are, but also in interpreting what the students found was critical part of the experience. And it also embedded the students that Kate had mentioned into a collaborative environment where you get to learn not only what do you need to do technically, but how do we do this? How do we work with each other in a professional setting in a way that's organized and consistent and gets the job done? And so that collaborative space is something that is really unique in a graduate school setting, especially in the classroom environment. And then finally, this secret sauce, in my opinion, was all about the human interactions, and really started with Kate and Sylvia. To have those two, who are amazing scientists and amazing educators, really helped drive what was going to happen in the classroom, and then drive the experience that we all had, was the secret sauce. And then roping in all the people of NERRS and the energy and enthusiasm and expertise that they brought to the table, I think is really what made it the fantastic experience that it was. So I'm going to wrap it up there, Kate, but again, just end with a huge thank you for all those who are involved. It's been a great experience.
Thanks, Paul. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to jump in and highlight some of what the students did in the class and how they were able to meet the needs of the 7 reserves. And so, as I said, when we developed this class, we really didn't have any idea how many students were going to enroll in it. And we ended up having 14 students, which divides very nicely with the number 7. And so we had groups of 2 students working with the 7 reserves. And in the following slides, I'll be giving really high level highlights of what the students found and the questions that the reserves asked. So you get a little bit of an idea of the different flavors of questions that were asked because of that flexibility that we designed into the process, and how the students use these kind of 4 core analyses to answer these wide ranges of questions, as well as a few kind of like extras that the students threw in. Okay. So we're just going to kind of like travel around the US here. So we'll start at the Great Bay Reserve. They had 3 questions. They were interested in investigating possible warming trends in the estuary, examining trends in particulate loading and water clarity at the river mouth, and then investigating trends in nutrient loading over time with the lens of population growth and implementation of a wastewater stream nitrate reduction. So Lizzie and Lindsay were the ones that worked on this project. They found using the Mann-Kendall trend test and sun slope that the river mouth was warming overall and in spring months, and that the open estuary was warming in summer. The river mouth turbidity was decreasing in fall, and that the open estuary turbidity was decreasing overall in summer and fall. They found, so close. Okay. Cyclic patterns were shortening at the river mouth, and that there were no significant trends in nitrite and nitrate, and that spring precipitation, was decreasing over time. At the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Maryland, they were interested in comparing nutrient loads pre and post wastewater treatment plant upgrades in 2015, to determine their impact on water quality. And so the students used breakpoints analysis and Mann-Kendall trend tests to determine that there were some changes, but their changes were not uniform. And these analyses were conducted by Jess Briggs and Cassandra Ceballos. So at Iron Pot Landing, they did see lowering of nitrate and phosphate partially due to the upgrades. They also saw some decreases at Railroad Crossing, but they also saw some increasing at Mattapone, and Kyle can correct me at the end of this if I mispronounce the site, but that it was actually increasing, and this is one of their most pristine areas, and there were no obvious changes in the watershed, so there were also some kind of surprises from the analyses. At North Inlet-Winyah Bay Reserve, they were interested in 3 questions. One was investigating whether runoff from development draining into Devido Creek has led to nutrient loading into that system. They had previously documented increases in time at Oyster Landing, and they wanted to know if eutrophication has cascaded and is impacting primary production, so an understanding of how that's impacting the chlorophyll trends. And then North Inlet has a relatively pristine estuary, so a time series of pH indicating whether those estuaries are susceptible to ocean acidification. So Bennett and Adriana were the 2 students that worked on this. They used breakpoint and trend analyses to answer these questions. And they found that increased ammonia and phosphate in the ocean dominated the estuary. And that was in connection to the sea level rise question, And then in terms of anthropogenic development over here, they did see increased nitrate in the river dominated estuary. Overall, they saw increased chlorophyll A that had about a 4-year lag from the nutrient increase. And they also found some season specific changes in some cases. At the GTM Reserve, they were interested in investigating the potential impact of ENSO on long-term chlorophyll, determining if one of their sites could be used as a reference site for resistance to eutrophication or a lack of a chlorophyll trend, and then try to elucidate drivers of change and inform management actions in nutrient-impaired water bodies surrounding 2 of their sites. Sophia and Danny were 2 of the students who worked on this, and I wanted to highlight not just their final slide, but kind of like an earlier slide, because they did some really interesting things with trends, as well as conducting wavelet analysis and analyzing teleconnection patterns to determine that chlorophyll A was correlating with sea surface temperature during the spring season, and that it was also following an ENSO pattern. So taking some of the analyses and running with them and doing some really interesting things there to answer those questions about connections to ENSO. At Rookery Bay, there were questions that were specifically related to restoration efforts. So for their first question, they were interested in, there has been restoration at Blackwater Bay, and they were interested in whether they were interested in analysis, of salinity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen to identify changes in freshwater input at that location resulting from those restoration efforts. And then the second question that they were interested in was that increasing development could be impacting nutrient loading in the estuary. And they were interested in an analysis of chlorophyll as an indicator of nutrient loading within the ecosystem to be compared to the development over time. And so this analysis was carried out by Emma Blackford and Ian Hart. They found that there was, they used Mann-Kendall trend test and sun slope with the time series decomposition to identify significant increasing trends in water temperature and decreasing trends in dissolved oxygen. And they were also able to match spikes in their data to major events such as hurricanes that also aligned with breakpoints and also showed up in their seasonal decomposition and time series decomposition over here as well. At South Slough, they had 2 questions. The main input of freshwater into, I think I might have mixed these up here. The main freshwater input into Padilla Bay is an agricultural drainage called the Joe Leary Slough, which is regulated by a tide gate. They're interested in comparing ammonium along the estuarine gradient from the slough, they were interested in comparing ammonium along the estuarine gradient to the shallow eelgrass meadows, and also comparing nutrient concentrations with phytoplankton biomass in the eelgrass. And again, this is for South Slough. So Peter and Charlie both worked on this analysis, and they used breakpoint analysis to show that there was a sharp decline in eelgrass density following a major heat wave, where you can see the heat wave shown. Oops. Oh man, this is being a little bit difficult here. Sorry about that. They were able to use temperature breakpoints and eelgrass breakpoints with knowledge of when the heat wave occurred to analyze this data. So in addition to conducting all of these really great analyses, the students also produced a technical report. And I should mention that the format and content of the report was determined by the reserve partners during the development of the course. The students also gave a live webinar that it was attended by over 60 people in the NERRS community to share their findings, and you can find the recording of that webinar on our project page. And finally, we worked with the Science Collaborative graphic design team to reformat those student reports and presentations into a 2-pager that could communicate findings for the reserves that were specifically interested in having this format. So as with teaching any class, whether it's being taught for the first time or the 10th time or the 20th time, we wanted to know what went well and what did not go well. So we sent a short survey to students, and this is some of what we heard back. Students felt like they learned a lot about data analysis, and Paul and I were actually kind of surprised by this because some of these students really had very impressive data skills coming into the class. And we were working on some of these, like I said, bread and butter type analyses, but it was really great to see that this was such a big learning opportunity in terms of the data analysis, which is what we hoped for. The field trip was a really big highlight. Students really appreciated spending time with each other, being outdoors, and getting that connection to doing place-based work. And they actually also really valued the time that we spent with Mark McConnell, who was an elder from the Fond du Lac tribe, learning about the place from that perspective. And then working on something with reserves that's directly useful was really rewarding, and some of the students actually motivated some of the students to do a better job. Some of the things that could have gone better was that the timing of engagement could have maybe been timed a little more optimally. Sometimes it didn't always work out when we had plans for checking in with the reserves and when they were completing their analyses. So that's something that could potentially be optimized in the future. We also found that reserves and students wanted to be able to explain the trends they were seeing in a quantitative way. So understanding correlations and driver analysis, which was outside of the scope of the class. So those were kind of things that we saw from both students and reserves that could be improved. I wanted to share a couple of student and reserve testimonials from this class that when we kind of like had an open answer or open-ended question, what did you really think about this experience? One student said, out of all the graduate classes I've taken, this class has taught me the most. It has made me a better RWIS and scientist. This class was great. I think it 100% should be offered in the future. It was such a unique structure, and I love that everything we learned was in an applied real project. I've never taken a class like this before, and it's definitely one that I will remember and pull from in the future. This class did a fantastic job of expanding my toolkit of time series analysis techniques that will be undoubtedly invaluable throughout my career. Using real data from a long-term monitoring network and engaging with people working in that network was a great motivator and showcased real uses for the skills we learned. Future cohorts of graduate students would benefit from this experience. And then lastly, it's a rarity to get such hands-on experience in graduate school, especially when it comes to data analysis outside of our own projects and community partnerships. Learning about coastal estuaries provides more context to different ecosystems and better prepares us for graduation. We sent like a really kind of like a mirrored survey out to our reserve partners. And so I wanted to share a couple of thoughts from and testimonials from that. I think this is a great partnership opportunity with the NERRS. I think that the students being able to look at something that is real and also previously not analyzed is invaluable. I always love working with students in our field, since that was always something that was done, or since that was something that was done for me when I was in their shoes. It also helped us answer a nagging question in our data that had hounded us for years. And finally, I really enjoyed working with the students. They were professional, taught us some statistical techniques, and explored data in ways that we never would have considered. So when we just asked them kind of point blank, should we offer this course again? We got a 100% answer that yes, both from the student perspective and from the reserve perspective, that we should offer this again. And so when we go back to our class goals, there were two pieces. We wanted to use SWMP data to identify and address management needs using a data-driven approach. We were able to accomplish that. We also wanted to provide this high quality training opportunity for graduate students. And the students did agree that we were able to like really improve their data analysis skills, and also that they learned a lot about doing collaborative science. So there are some additional project resources that we generated. So, excuse me. When we started this out, we were going to develop tools and put them on GitHub, and it was going to be like really tool driven. But as we worked with our reserve partners, they really wanted more of an education bent to this, and that seemed like it was a more useful way to share these resources. So this is a GitHub repository with all of the analyses, and that we specifically developed the code so that if you're just interested in using the analyses, you can take them and use them, but you could also use them in an educational context. And it's also a flavor of how we might set this up for future iterations of this class. So here's a little bit of like for those of you who use R, or maybe even for those of you who are like R curious, what these codes look like. So they're commented out with really kind of a lot of extra information about what the tests actually are, what are the assumptions of the test, how do you actually interpret them, and walk you through the process of doing it with an example from NERRS data that we actually used in the class. So coming back to these project goals, we had kind of many things, and the ones that were kind of really unique to this pilot class were these here. So we wanted to use this graduate course, excuse me, to provide a high quality training opportunity. We wanted to provide a sustained mechanism for future SWMP synthesis using this course. We wanted to increase NERRS visibility for the wider community. And we also wanted to position the NERRS SWMP synthesis group to pursue future funding to address this capacity need. And so now we're starting to think, okay, we did this pilot, what's next, right? Because a pilot is a test case. So kind of our dream when we put this together and as we rounded out the class is that this would be a NERRS SWMP synthesis graduate course. So a semester-long course that's really based around the way that we operated this for this Catalyst class. We kind of envision this being a bridge between the Holling Scholar and a MAD Fellow. So a Holling Scholar is a really fast-paced undergraduate opportunity for research at reserves that occurs over the summer, whereas a MAD Fellowship or a Margaret A. Davidson Fellowship is a 2-year program for graduate students that are working on a wide variety of research questions that are aligned with needs for reserves. And this could potentially be bridging that gap where it's a semester-long graduate student course. There would be specifically focused on analyzing SWMP data. It would allow students to get this opportunity to learn how to do these types of analyses, while also really kind of, as I said, increasing the visibility of the NERRS, kind of another feather in the NERRS cap of training, and also potentially giving opportunity to increase the visibility of the NERRS to the next generation of the workforce, essentially, that is going to be coming into doing science and management and other facets of this. In our vision, this would rotate to different NERRS or NERRS academic partners. So some of the reserves have an academic partner as their state partner. Some of them are more of like a .gov or an agency, but still work closely with academic partners. So we would envision this maybe on a biannual basis every other year, rotating around. And it was actually really low cost to implement. The biggest cost of this, or the only cost really that are associated with it, is paying somebody to teach if needed. Some people already have a teaching appointment where they don't require salary, and then just the field trip for the students. So it's a really a pretty low cost for a high impact, high amount of impact for what the students offer in this class. So again, this would increase our capacity to analyze SWMP data. It would be a high quality training for undergraduate or graduate students. It would increase the NERRS profile, and it could also be an opportunity to recruit new talent to the NERRS as well as NERRS partners. So as we're thinking about this, we're kind of in this mode of now wanting to like essentially do a needs assessment or an interest assessment. So we're trying to find out what interest there is in continuing this as a NERRS program and what are the available resources to do that. The next step would be developing an implementation model, and depending on what that implementation model looked like, we would then develop a program using the Catalyst project that I just presented on behalf of our project team as kind of like a starting point or a jumping off point. And then the last piece would be to actually deliver that program and carry through the implementation. So that's really most of what I have for you. I guess my little caveat to all the good reviews is that when the students came up for their field trip, I had a puppy at the time, so they spent a lot of time with Fern, so that might have contributed to the good reviews. We do have a project page. We can put the link to it in the chat. There's also a QR code here on your screen, so feel free to scan that, and I can come back to it. And then we're also we have this short survey to ask the questions essentially that I was alluding to earlier. So should we keep developing this into the future? So if you have a second, if you could fill out this really short survey, we'd hugely appreciate it. The main questions on here are, do you think it's valuable to develop this into some sort of program, the shape of which we don't know yet? Would you like to be involved in it? And then do you have opportunities to teach upper level undergraduate or graduate students? And then we also have space for general comments. So that's all I have for you. I have one more guest. If Kyle is on here, he was what represents the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Maryland, to share a little bit about his experience, and then we'll be happy to take any questions. So Kyle, are you online?
Yeah, so this experience was great. You know, we had our swamp stations set up, you know, when swamp became a thing. Our reserve is 3 components, and 3 out of our 4 primary stations are located at one of those components. And they were set up to answer that question that the students answered for us, that we just have not had the capacity to really deep dive in there to see if those wastewater treatment improvements really were starting to have an impact. And it was just such a good experience to work with them. And it was a great back and forth, you know, looking at the entire watershed. They, you know, figured some things out for us that we just didn't have the capacity to do. And really was able to answer that for us in a really definitive way that we've been able to share with a lot of our partners, as well as giving them all of that experience. And, you know, I couldn't have been happier with it. Like, expectations were high already, because these types of things are always, you know, pretty pleasurable, at least for me. But I mean, we exceeded all of them. And especially, you know, finding that our most pristine station at that component is actually the one doing the worst for reasons unknown. So that's going to be driving some future research questions for us as well. And I've always taken the opportunity to try and mentor as many undergrads and graduate students as possible. And this class is just the perfect way to do that. So, you know, I would advocate for this program, you know, every day of the week. You know, will I be able to host it? No, but I definitely would support hosting it anywhere.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Okay, so that's all I have for everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions, and feel free to pitch questions to Sylvia, our collaborative lead, or Paul, our technical lead.
Thanks, Kate. Looks like you have at least one question there in the Q&A, and we can also unmute people if they want to verbalize their own questions. So I see at least one hand raised. So if you do want to ask a question verbally, we can do that too. So do you want to start with the one that's in the Q&A, the chat box, Kate?
Sure. Can you read them?
I sure will. Yeah. So first, the comment, wonderful course. You may have already mentioned it, but I'm wondering what degree programs were your students in? Did you have prereqs, for example, coding experience? And did student pairs use their own programming language of choice, or did you all do the instruction and projects in one language?
Ooh, those are really good questions. So Paul, you're going to have to help me a little bit with the student majors, but what I can say is everything was in R, but everyone kind of worked in R generally. That just is kind of the hip thing to do, I guess, right now. There were multiple components to that question. Can you repeat that again, Nick? So
Yeah.
there was the question about R,
Yeah,
the question about the majors.
Yep. What degree programs, and then did you have prereqs? So for example, coding experience, but you can name other
Yeah.
prereqs.
We did not have any prereqs. We had no idea what people were going to be coming in with, and we just ended up kind of working out. But we kind of started from scratch anyway, because even though we felt like a lot of the students were really proficient in coding, and a lot of them were, there was still lots of opportunity to learn. So kind of it didn't really matter where you were. We kind of started at the beginning anyway. But Paul, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the degree programs, at least off the top of my head, were freshwater and marine science. iBio's graduate program, which used to be zoology, I think they may have changed the name of that. And there may have been an engineering student. I was trying to remember if there was a civil
There
student.
was an engineering student. Yeah.
Okay. So I think those are the three graduate programs that were represented.
Okay. All right, so we've got some folks who have their hands raised. So Jim, I think you were first, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. So quick, my background is I actually used to be a swamp coordinator with the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And in that role, you know, everyone's time is dictated by funding and what they're allocated towards. So from a reserve perspective, we did put a lot of effort into swamp, but it's often hard to find time to do the proper analyses of those time series. And like you had mentioned, you know, hauling scholars are great. They come in for a little bit and they do a good job, but they don't have like a whole lot of time to dive into it. And then the MAD students generally have their own project and may tangentially use yours. So I think that this is, I just want to echo or comment that this is a phenomenal avenue in which to bring in outside expertise and get help reserves with, you know, analyzing these large data sets that they may or may not have time to do themselves while trading off, you know, a learning experience. And that's kind of just, you know, what the reserves do, I think. This is science and education. So it's a great way to help the student community and also bolster the capacity of the research system as a whole.
Awesome. Always happy to hear a vote of confidence. I appreciate it. It's good to hear that we're barking up the right tree.
Okay, so I see Lauren also has her hand raised. So Lauren, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to ask your question as well.
Yeah, hi, this is Lauren Sutton, also from the Chesapeake Bay NERR. We service Jim, but so currently we have funding through the IRA capacity funds to look back at our swamp data and try to pair it with our other biological data. So I guess my real question is like, how it seemed like you had the decision tree of whether to focus on one NERR versus multiple NERRs across the country. So what's your thought on like the time? Well, I have like 3 questions if I can ask all of them. But so my first question is, what do you think the time frame would be? Like, do you think it'd be a whole course if you just focused with one NERR? Like, there's so much data per NERR.
Oh yeah.
But seemed like that was a really like a clear decision to bring in multiple NERRs. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so way back when we were even starting this proposal, it was like, oh, we should do something with swamp synthesis. And I actually, so I did my postdoc at Center for Limnology where Paul is with Hillary Dugan, who Paul was the postdoc advisor of. And so I was like, you know, hey, do you guys want to share a master's student or whatever? And Hillary was actually the one that said, hey, what if we you guys did the Gleon model with this? And I said, oh, well, that sounds great. Paul, would you be interested in doing this with me? And so there was never really like a decision made that it was like, there's going to be all these reserves. That's just kind of how the whole project started. I think that going forward, this could be really flexible in a lot of ways. It could be like, one reserve is like, I've got so many questions that I want to answer, because you could certainly do a whole class with one reserve's data, or you could just do a couple of reserves. You could have 7 like we did. I think when we were having conversations with our reserve partners, kind of like after the class, we talked about a little bit of this, and it really quickly became clear that like you could do this so many different ways and they would all be really interesting and valuable. So I don't think there's any kind of like one way to do it or a certain number of reserves that's like the way it has to be. And I think that's also one of the things that keeps it fresh and interesting and fun, is to have a lot of flexibility and have that change over time.
Totally. Yeah. Did you find, like, did the number of students in this course affect that decision? Seemed like you had students pair up, but I could also see this working if you had a larger class for multiple students on one project versus one student per project. I guess, was there forethought in that, or is that also kind of how it shook out?
Yeah, we thought about it and we realized that we didn't have any control over the situation. We were just going to have to deal with what happened once we knew how many students were enrolled. But we knew for sure that we didn't want to have any less than 2 students on a project. So it was a little bit of like, well, you had to be on your toes and like see how many students you ended up getting in the class. So you could, you know, make your plans as much as you can, and then you just kind of had to be like nimble when the time came to like make those decisions on how the class would actually be carried out.
Right. Okay, I have like a million more questions, but maybe I'll catch you at the national meeting. Thank you so much.
So big thank you to our speakers for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for joining us on a Friday. As Kate said, it's probably a great way to either take a break in the middle of the day for you if you're just getting started, or maybe it's your lunch. I don't know, depending on where you are. But either way, it's a nice way to maybe not have to do as much regular work on a Friday. So thanks for joining us. We'll catch you in the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.